morning. I'm so glad to see you all on this rainy day. It didn't get you down. Many of you were in worship yesterday, and so you were able to hear a wonderful sermon that Chaplain Kibben offered us. We're so delighted to have her back today, and frankly, with a small crowd, that will be, I think, a little more interactive after she gives her lecture for some question and answer time. Most of you probably know that this, but I know there are some who are in Highlands for the first time maybe and don't know this. This whole lecture series was named in honor of the late Reverend Don Mullen, who served here at First Presbyterian Church as a parish associate for several years. And really it's named after both he and his wife. And their journey into ministry, their journey in the mission field around the world, providing medical mission and ministry to folks the world over. I'm sorry that Patsy can't be here. She comes here when her daughters are able to bring her, and they have many obligations with grandchildren and such this weekend. But Missy, Dawn and Patsy's daughter, says, Daddy was somebody who always encouraged and pushed people to think beyond where they were. Not necessarily with his own agenda for how to think, but he always wanted people to expand themselves, to grow. And so it was appropriate, I think, that we have Chaplain Kibben here with us today, as she talks about particularly prayer and her role as the chaplain of the U.S. House of Representatives. A little history from her. Reverend Kibben was a Navy chaplain. She served in the Navy for over 30 years, serving the Navy and the Marine Corps. She retired in 2018 as, I'm going to get this right, she was Chief of Chaplains of the Chaplain Corps of the United States Navy, Rear Admiral. Retired in 2018. She told me she put her feet up for a brief sabbatical and then received an appointment, which is, she helped me and a group of us that had lunch with her yesterday to serve as the chaplain of the House of Representatives, which is really an election by the entire House. It's a bipartisan position that she holds. And so that clarity, I think, is important for us as we start to listen. And I don't think I have too much more introduction for you. After she speaks, there will be plenty of time for question and answer, and then following that, more time to engage with Margaret in Coleman Hall, which is just out here and around the corner with some snacks and goodies. So let's welcome her.
Thank you all for such a wonderful welcome for this weekend. Yesterday was lovely. Yes, I'm still a little under the weather, though the weather has come down a little harder. I, however, seem to have lifted up just a little bit more, but I'm very grateful to be here. I may go running for the water bottle here shortly, but overall, I feel just exuberant being here. So thank you for the health you have brought me, the spiritual health and the fellowship that is part of this community. A community I'd never heard of before, and now will never forget. And hopefully this is not the only time I will ever be here. I do enjoy, this is just a lovely little oasis here in the middle of, well, nowhere. As Emily said, I had the privilege of serving in the Navy and Marine Corps for 35 years, and as a chaplain. And there is a significant difference between being a chaplain and being a pastor of a church, or a priest or a rabbi, inasmuch as you are co-religionists here at the Presbyterian Church, or you at least acknowledge the fact that this is a Presbyterian church even though you are Baptist. You acknowledge the fact that there is a certain theology to which you all ascribe. Chaplaincy, not so much. Chaplaincy allows individuals who have come from your congregations, your sons and daughters, you yourselves, to have come from your congregations to serve our country, but not leave behind your faith. When individuals come to service in the government, and certainly in military service, they are not expected to leave everything behind. In fact, their faith is part of what informs them, it strengthens them. So what is the government's responsibility to ensuring that people have the opportunity to freely express their religion, to continue on their faith journey? And so the chaplaincy was established in all the services, and likewise in the House and the Senate. The House and the Senate slightly different. Now, those representatives initially were leaving home and coming to Washington, D.C. and staying there. That's not quite the way it is now. And in the early years of Congress, there weren't a lot of churches, so the chaplains did play, in many ways, the role of pastor. But more importantly, the role of chaplain was to provide for our own. So were there other Presbyterians? I could speak that secret squirrel language of Presbyterian. I would facilitate for others. That is, you are not Presbyterian, you would like to find out where a church is or a synagogue or a mosque. It was my responsibility as a military chaplain, and I assume that same responsibility as chaplain of the house, to ensure that you have a place where you can worship, where you have what you need to continue to grow spiritually and in faith. But I also care for all. This is particularly clear in military service because, there's a whole bunch of people who are telling you what to do. Or you're in a hospital and somebody wants to poke another needle in you. But a chaplain is there to care for you regardless of who you are, where you come from, what your life situation is, and that relationship is sacrosanct. It's sacred. It is, in fact, a sanctuary for people to come and let things out and know that there's confidentiality there and that they can be safe there wherever they are, and to care for them in such a way that they would know, and this is how I translate it, that God is transcendent, that God is present in their lives, and that they have access to God. That's my understanding as a military chaplain. It's how I grew up for 35 years. And so when I was given this opportunity to serve as chaplain of the house, I just translated it into the house. And to be perfectly frank, I assumed that this was going to be a pretty easy job. It's the same demographic, right? It's the same people who are coming from the same states and communities, and they're representing, the full gamut of really what is represented in military service. And that in itself is true. However, there are 435, at least on my side of the building, there are 435 representatives who, in fact, are not called representatives for nothing. They represent every opinion, every emotion, every state of arrogance that I've ever met in my entire life. And yet, I will tell you that in that same body, there is the salt of the earth, in that they represent truly the United States well. Now, I will tell you from the start, in members of the House, there is at least the 10, 10, and 80 rule. There are 10% of the crazies on that side and 10% of the crazies on that side. And the 80% of the middle are more like the rest of us. However, I'm getting ahead of myself. I want to tell you a little bit about how this chaplaincy even began. It wasn't the establishment of the chaplaincy really wasn't about what I just shared with you, the provide, the facilitate, the care piece. It was really about finding a way to establish a grounding, a foundation for their cooperation among each other. So, I'm going to start with a lot of history. And for those of you who are history buffs, you'll love this. For those of you who are don't check out, because this is sort of important because it shows you a little bit about why there is still challenge, not only in my position, but just challenge in general when we start talking about faith and government. Since the beginning of the Republic, Congress has retained and paid permanent clergy to offer prayers to God on the government's behalf. That is the starting point. They pay me, as I indicated yesterday from the pulpit, to pray to God on their behalf. That is essentially the only thing on my job description. So every legislative day, both the House and the Senate are opened in prayer. Now, in my case, they aren't very long prayers, neither in Chaplain Black's case. They last about a minute and a half. Imagine Emily preaching a minute and a half sermon. That's kind of how I view my minute and a half is my opportunity to convey something of great importance and to bring people to a sense of God's presence in a short amount of time, but it isn't always easy. Again, I digress. From the First Continental Congress, a man by the name of Thomas Cushing, who was in Massachusetts, he asked that, it was, now we're talking 1774, September 1774. He requested that they begin the House, that Congress, in prayer. And he just happened to know a local Anglican priest who was ministering there in Philadelphia at Christ Church, a guy by the name of Jacob Duché. Now, this guy has an amazing history, but you only get him as a sort of a footnote in my conversation. Definitely worth looking into as you perhaps if you have any interest. Anyway, so Thomas Cushing suggested that they bring this local Anglican priest in to open the house in prayer. But John Jay and John Rutledge objected, because that's what congressmen do, on the grounds that the assembled delegates represented so many religious denominations that it would be impossible for all to join together in worship. Indeed, a religious service might exacerbate their differences. And this is how it started. Now, as it turns out, part of the challenge is that here we have an Anglican. By the way, we're talking 1774. The Anglican was the Church of England. Where were his loyalties? Were they with England, or were they with the new and upcoming United States, with the colonies? But the also was that he was, as an Anglican, he was used to form prayers. You know, they were prayers within the Book of Common Order, Book of Common Worship. Whereas some of the others, like Presbyterians and some of the Congregationalists from the Northeast, they liked the much more extemporaneous prayers. Sam Adams, from the Northeast, not just a beer maker, said, "In no way am I a bigot. I can pray with any man who loves his God and loves his country." And so it was on September 7th that the Reverend Jacob Duché offered prayers. Now, on that day, he did offer several form prayers right out of the Book of Common Worship, and he also prayed from Psalm 35. I encourage you to look at that later. But he then, as if he knew that he was to kind of bring all the pieces together, he in fact offered an extemporaneous prayer. The prayer he offered was to a Continental Congress who realized that they had just been notified that there had been an attack on Boston. And so Jacob Duché made a point, as every good chaplain should do, is try to relate to the events of the day. And so his prayers were laid out. Now, it just so happened Psalm 35 was the psalm for the day. He did not select it. It would be, as one might call it, providential. But the psalm particularly was apropos because it makes a reference to the divine refuge from the onslaught of foreign powers. And then in his extemporaneous prayer, which, oh, by the way, they chose not to record, except some sly soul later did. He, in fact, made a very clear extemporaneous prayer that he was against what, in fact, the actions of England were on the colonies. Now, John Adams wrote to his wife, Abigail. John was a prolific writer, in case you don't know that. He wrote to Abigail quite frequently. And he said it was if heaven had ordained that psalm. And Silas Deane from Connecticut said the readings were accidentally extremely applicable. Providence, if you will. Now, Duché then was selected informally as the first chaplain to the Continental Congress. So, however, even his selection began with some politics. Remember, he's an Anglican pastor, and there were some within that delegation who thought that the best way to move, in general, Anglican clergy to support the cause for liberty was to identify a well-known Anglican cleric. Jacob Duché was extremely well known in the Anglican Church. Continental Congress needed some help ingratiating the revolutionary movement with the Anglicans who had established themselves, particularly in Philadelphia, but all throughout the colonies. And so, again, John Adams writes to Abigail, and he says that Joseph Reed, another member, never more guilty of a master stroke of policy in establishing Jacob Duché as the new chaplain. Sam Adams, again, many of our warmest friends are members of the Church of England, and so we thought it prudent to select Duché, all to shore up support among Anglicans in the colonies. Just when you thought everything was pure and simple, no, no, no. Even the first chaplain was being used as a political tool. So, it just so happened, however, that Jacob Duché served for about 2 years informally as the chaplain, more formally later, within those first 2 years. But as much as Jacob Duché had ingratiated himself, not to just the other Anglicans, but to these representatives, to these delegates, he also then fell off the face of favor. When on the 4th of, I'm sorry, not yet, hold on that thought. On July 4th, 1776, that very day that the Declaration of Independence was signed, he wrote that, "Be it resolved that no longer would prayers for King George III be included in the formal prayers." He as much as erased the king's name from the Book of Common Prayer. Now you think about that. That's a pretty gutsy thing to do. That was illegal in English law, according to English law, treasonous. He himself could have been imprisoned. And in fact, in 1777, he was, by the English, for having been a part of the other side. Now, it just so happened that when he was taken prisoner in 1777, he wrote a letter to George Washington, and he urged Washington to surrender. That's quite a switch on his part, don't you think? On the one hand, he's quoting Psalm 35 and encouraging people to join the movement. And then in 1777, now under duress, he suggests that they surrender. The response, our buddy John Adams says, he is an apostate and a traitor. On July 9th, and following that, in the Constitutional Convention in May through September 1789, other chaplains in the Continental Congress and the Congress of the Confederate were established to continue with the daily prayers. But as that happened, I want to make sure I stay on my notes here. I added a few things as I was working on this last night. As it happens, for a while there, then when they reestablished that in May of 1787, there were no official chaplains. There had been some other chaplains who had been brought in to say prayer. They were informally the chaplains for the body. But in the establishment in 1787, in May through September, for that constitutional convention, they did not have any prayers. So they started, they started the Continental Congress. And Benjamin Franklin realized that there was very little progress taking place. And perhaps he thought prayer would be our only common bond. He made a point of saying so, to the point of that speech that I quoted yesterday, that you perhaps have heard bits and pieces of, that God governs in the affairs of men. And unless the Lord builds the house, they labor in vain. He therefore, and he made the motion, I beg to move that henceforth prayers imploring the assistance of heaven's blessing on our deliberations be held in the assembly every morning before we proceed to business. That's a pretty convincing piece, and in fact, because they had had prayers continually for the last 3 years prior, here in this Constitutional Convention, however, in 1787, he failed to win the day for many reasons. For one, he was a little late in the game. They had already, in May, established the Constitutional Convention, and here it is already June. The second is, many were afraid that if we start now, we've already started this convention, we've been in it a month. If we start now, you know what that's going to look like? The public is going to be aware of our standstill. The rest of the colonies will know that we as their delegates are not making any progress. So God forbid we should have somebody pray for us, because that's as much as admitting our faults. Anybody know that phrase, plus ça change, plus c'est la même chose? More things change, the more things stay the same. And oh, by the way, there was no funding. All right, so let's flash forward to 1789, 2 years later. And now we are at the first Congress. The very first Congress was established and resolved, one of the first things that they resolved is that they would appoint, both for the House and for the Senate, their own chaplains. Now, the chaplains would be of two different denominations. One would be and of the denominations, we're talking about this great diversity of religion, right? No, we're talking about Episcopals and Methodists and Presbyterians and Baptists and Congregationalists and maybe a few Unitarians. That's not a wide diversity in my book, but they would make sure that there were two different in each of the two chambers. And what would happen is a prayer would be offered each day, but then the next day they would switch rostrums. So Barry Black, who's the chaplain of the Senate now, and myself, for instance, I would say prayers in the House one day, and then tomorrow I would say it in the Senate, and he would say prayers in the House. But on April 25th, 1789, the first appointed chaplain for the Senate was Samuel Provoost, who was an Episcopalian, and you'll be happy to know on the 1st of May, 1789, the first House chaplain was a Presbyterian by the name of William Lynn. Now in September 1789, on the 22nd, their salaries were voted on. I'm not sure what happened in those 3 months between. Perhaps they weren't paid. But 3 days before the final agreement on the Bill of Rights, and this is an important piece, their salaries were agreed upon. You may be interested to know is $500 a year, which works out to about $17,000 in our money. But what's interesting is, because it was only 3 days before the Bill of Rights, when they went to vote on the Bill of Rights, which you know includes the Establishment Clause, and that is to make sure that church and state are sufficiently separate, that the church will not make any rules to the state, or to the church, and that the church will not influence the state. And who was the author of that? None other than James Madison. And yet he voted 3 days before on the salary of the chaplain. The Bill of Rights makes it sound like, no, that's impossible. And yet 3 days later, in fact, in voting in the Bill of Rights, he did not rescind, did not bring back another motion to do away with the chaplains. He later wrote, it was much later, and James Madison apparently on this particular subject seemed to vacillate. It was later he wrote clearly of his opposition. We were not, to have a chaplain in the House and the Senate, to have a chaplain in Congress was essentially establishing a national religion. It also spoke against the idea of equal rights. Now, keeping in mind what was happening is that if you were to bring a chaplain to the rostrum to pray, that chaplain would be praying according to his faith tradition. And is that in fact inclusive enough of other denominations present? Would you in fact be willing to bring a Catholic chaplain to the position of House or Senate chaplain? So it really was a very contentious issue, and yet since 1789, there has been a chaplain. Not without challenges, however. As we talked about in terms of Madison's own frustrations, that didn't constitute in itself a challenge to the chaplaincy. But if we go a little bit further into history, in 1832, there was a Catholic chaplain appointed to the Senate. Now, we may probably have no sense of how anti-Catholic the first Americans were. There was an extreme anti-Catholic movement. The question, particularly as it was reflected to this chaplain, was his loyalty going to be to the United States or would it be to the Pope? Surely, because he is a priest, he has sworn his allegiance to the Pope. Congress was the other fear was that Catholics would influence the government, and we would fall right back into the same challenge that had been experienced in Europe, that Catholicism and the government would fall hand in hand. And so Congress received an inordinate number of petitions to end the chaplaincies. I mean, Inordinate. Petition after petition. One petition involved 60 people and 10 states represented. That was one petition, but there were countless sent on behalf of it. The poor soul who was, in fact, the chaplain appointed in 1832, he lasted about a year in the job until he resigned, finally. But he said very clearly in a letter he wrote in sort of his apologetic for his role there in the chaplaincy in the Senate, he said, "My loyalty has always been first and foremost to these United States. I know how to serve Caesar and to serve God. And in this case, I knew that my role as chaplain was completely pure of anything untoward with respect to my allegiance." It wasn't until, so that's 1833, it wasn't until March of 2000 that another Catholic chaplain was assigned to the House, and that to the House, Dan Coughlin. Now, 1850, the role and existence of chaplains were again under serious dispute, and there were another flood of petitions. And there were that many who opposed the chaplaincy from the beginning. And ironically, it's the Baptists. I say that right now because if I were to tell you who is most supportive of a role of chaplains, it's Baptists. Some were again concerned about this rise of Catholicism. When this other fellow who was assigned in 1832, there wasn't a large percentage of Catholics in the United States. But because of the influx of Irish into the United States in that same time frame, the rise of Catholicism was significant. And once again, the job had the job had become competitive. There were pastors out there who were competing, who were vying for the job. And there were delegates who were just considered that untoward, how men would be fighting so viscerally for a job of service to God and country. But more importantly, and I think this was the real reason why it was such an issue in 1850, what was taking place at that point was this movement against slavery. And the chaplains became caught in the crossfire. Were they for or were they against? And as a political tool, again, William Henry Channing in 1863 selected from the Republican Party, he selected an individual because of his views against slavery. And it was against another very popular candidate who was for slavery. So the re-examination of chaplaincies began, both in the House and in the Senate, from 1850 to 1853. And at some point, both the House and the Senate suspended regular chaplaincies. Suspended at this point. And they decided what they would do is they would bring in local pastors, because we know that they have no opinion. So they brought in local pastors, and in fact what they found out is that they very much had opinions, and so they were never really sure what they were getting. By the way, these informal chaplains, these folks who were local, they weren't getting paid at all. This was all on their own time and from their own position. And they argued that the Congress and the House, Senate decided that, this is okay, we can live with this, it's all right. But then eventually, they realized that, I lost my spot here. So at some point they decided there will be no chaplains at all. Just disestablish the chaplaincy altogether. They did that for about 2 months. And they realized that was probably foolish. And so they brought in a fellow by the name of Daniel Waldo, who is a 93-year-old Revolutionary War veteran. Surely he would be harmless. Poor Daniel Waldo, interestingly enough, if you go through the Chaplain Corps history, particularly on our website, because we haven't changed it yet, he's not even listed. And you know that Where's Waldo thing? Well, that's really what that's about. He didn't last very long. I don't know whether death overtook him or he just got tired of working in the job, but he didn't last very long. But he, in fact, was the one who took the position to reestablish chaplaincy in the House. The Senate took up the issue again in 1857, but in 1859 they determined that guest chaplains were too distant to be helpful. And here's where I think it really illustrates how valuable chaplains are in general in an institution such as this. The comment was that we need a chaplain of the body. We need someone who is acquainted with us, who is doing what we're doing, spending time with us, experiencing what we're experiencing, understanding the challenges we're facing, and isn't just coming in off the street cold. I want to take a pause there because when I think about my call to ministry, I had a call to ministry when I was about 14. Pretty unusual for a Presbyterian to have a call from the Spirit like that. But I had a great youth pastor, and I said, I want to do that. But at 17, I had a call specifically to military chaplaincy, to Navy chaplaincy. My dad had been a World War II vet. I also happened to be dating a fellow who was at the Naval Academy. And it didn't hurt that we went down to visit him on Parents' Weekend, and I saw all those wonderful uniforms in a magnificent chapel, and I said, I could do this. All right, a 17-year-old call, but that was a sense of call that I had to be a military chaplaincy. But one of the things I remember saying at 17, that the difference for me between being a parish minister and being a chaplain is that I could eat, sleep, breathe, and endure the same things my parishioners were eating, sleeping, breathing, and enduring. And my experience as a military chaplain was, in fact, just that. Whether it was a deployment, whether it was a 25-mile hike, whether it was combat, whether it was standing beside a hospital bed next to a dying Marine, I was there, I knew them, I was part of the body. The other thing I'll take a pause to say is that as much as that was a sentiment of the time, I can tell you that right now, that is a hard sentiment for them to admit. They like me there. They know I understand what they're going through. And I'll talk about this a little bit later. But the idea of me being aware of their vulnerabilities, having access to some of the challenges that they're facing, let's just say they're a little reticent. But they understand. They would not do away with the chaplaincy, I'm certain of it, today. But right now, I don't think they fully understand or will admit why. So let's go back to our challenges to the chaplaincy. We've survived since 1859, but later, in 1985, there was a court case called Marsh versus Chambers. And the challenge was, do we need chaplains either in the House or the Senate or in military service? The Marsh versus Chambers case was very much a case against military chaplaincy. The defense in Marsh versus Chambers is a little loose. I'll be perfectly honest, not being a lawyer. I will say, however, it's a little loose. But what they identified was, and this is how the chaplaincy stood as a result of this case, was that they argue that because, as I indicated, the chaplain's salary was approved 3 days before the Bill of Rights was approved, that everybody knew that chaplains were part of the institution, that the framers of the Establishment Clause must not have perceived that the chaplaincy was violating the Establishment Clause. That's one of the points that the Marsh versus Chambers brings out. They also pointed out that the founders did not consider opening prayers as symbolically placing the government's seal of approval on one religious view. That a chaplain prays does not mean that the United States imprimatur is on the theology of the prayer. And then thirdly, this makes me cringe a little, that chaplaincies are simply a tolerable acknowledgement of widely held beliefs held at the time. What are they saying? What they were saying at the establishment is that there were a bunch of Christians in 1789, and so therefore, of course, you would have Christians as chaplains. That faith was important to people at 1789, so of course you would have chaplains. And because there is a history of this, and it has been established, and the framers of the Constitution were okay with it, we're okay with it in 1985. I don't know how many lawyers are here, but that's a little loose in my book. I'm fine with it. I'm certainly happy with the results. But one has to wonder, if that's all you're saying is that chaplains are just sort of a tolerable expression of where we stood religiously in 1789, then what is the value of chaplains now? It's a very interesting question. I often wonder if my own congregation ponders that, or would. But the question of chaplaincy is, in fact, an issue. But so is the expression of religion among our members. I told you that you don't call them representatives for nothing. And so they are a full expression of faith traditions. We have a very wide and diverse group right now. We have a good number of Catholics, horrors to the original framers of the Constitution. We have a number of Presbyterians, of Methodists, a lot of Baptists. We also have several Jews, a lot of Jews really by proportion. We have a good percentage of Jews. We have a handful of Muslims. We have a Hindu. We have a Buddhist. We have humanists. We have atheists. We represent the full gamut of what is in fact expressed in the United States. So the question is, what role does religion have in government then? And I bring back what I shared with you initially, and that is, one does not give up one's faith when one serves one's country. Your faith has in fact become part of the framework from which you make your decisions. It is in fact, you may not articulate it in such a way, but your values, your morals, have been shaped and formed by what you believe. So naturally, how you vote, how you think, how you debate, how you discuss, how you work through issues are going to be informed by what you believe. But the challenge to it is that how outright should one be about expressing one's faith? Evangelical should one be when one is making a vote on the floor? How sure should one be to one's faith expression that you in fact have to say, God wants it this way? Do you say that on the floor? Is that a separation issue, a church and state issue? Is that an establishment issue? Or is that you representing yourself, your community, what your community believes in? It's a very, very interesting question. So I'll give you a couple quotes for you to chew on. The government's role is not to advance faith. That is the job of the individual and of religious institutions. So if the individual is representing one's community, the individual is also representing the government. And so the representative, the congressman or the senator, is, yes, indeed, responsive to the district from which they come, the state from which they come, but they are also representative of the government. And what comes out of their mouth is not just what you would have them say, but they are also then establishing what the government will in fact have to live with from this point forward. Do we inadvertently establish a religion by virtue of how we argue a bill? Government officials do not have to leave their faith behind, but they should share and speak in ways consistent with the Constitution. Do they, in fact, by what they say, allow for religious liberty to coexist? Do by what they say and the stands that they take, do they allow for the importance of religious literacy of other faith traditions? Are they, in fact, literate in other faith traditions? Martin Luther King Jr. said, "The church is not the matter or the servant of the state, but the church is the conscience of the state." Now here's where I think the entry is, for both a representative, senator, or for me. And that is, are we allowing our government to have a conscience? Do we allow our government to allow the conscience to speak into those deliberations? Granted, as James Madison said, no civil magistrate is a competent judge of religious truth. nor are courts arbiters of scriptural interpretation. But we need to be a spokesperson of God, as Representative Barbara Jordan from Texas indicated in the late 70s. You are to be a servant of God, not a spokesperson for God, as a representative, as a senator. But as a chaplain, I am in fact a spokesperson for God. And as one of the, from the legislative, John Carr, who is the legislative affairs to the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, we need to be political, but not partisan. We need to be principled, but not ideological. Civil, but not soft. Engaged, but not used. And here is how I differ from my confreres of 1789. I cannot be used as a political tool. I've had members come up to me and say, "You wouldn't vote for this bill, would you?" And I can't tell you how many times I have bitten my tongue. I tell you, that is an organ that regenerates. I can't tell you how many times I have talked to a member and they are saying something that I am just so adamantly appalled at. But that is not my role. It is to allow them to be who they are, to challenge them, if necessary, but to be very careful in doing so. To be political but not partisan, to be principled, to be civil but not soft, to engage but not to be used. It's a very interesting piece. I leave you with this, though, that there are saints in Caesar's household, as Paul to the Philippians said. There truly are, and there are people who are working this through. This is not an easy path to take. Religion matters. It has since the institution of our country. Religion matters. It's why our country was founded, is so that people could come here to the United States to get away from governments who were oppressing their religion, their religious expression. People came to Philadelphia at the very time the Continental Congress was being established. They came to Philadelphia because William Penn had established a state that allowed for what we know as Quakers now, but they were the Society of Friends. He allowed Presbyterians of all people. He allowed everyone to come to be able to worship in their own faith tradition without government interference, and established the Pennsylvania government accordingly. That's how our government was established as a country. The idea of the free expression of religion in the Bill of Rights. And so how do we balance that free expression with our inclination to say it's the only expression? How do we balance this incredible passion we have for what we believe to a respect for what others believe? How do we take what is principled and differentiate it from just an ideological stance? Where do we take that path? It is, in fact, a very fascinating, challenging position that everyone who represents you in that building takes very seriously. And I, as their chaplain, I wander that path with them, and I'm very grateful to do that. So a little bit of history on the chaplaincy, and I think probably the best part of this morning will be your questions, and I look forward to taking those. I did have one request ahead of time, so while you're chewing on your question, somebody asked if I would share a prayer that I have offered on the floor. And I indicated yesterday in my sermon that my prayers are, in fact, not partisan, but they're also intended to be inclusive. Now, that's a challenge, right? Because I know in whose name I pray. And nobody has ever told me I can't pray in Jesus' name. I'll just put that out there. Nobody has ever told me I can't. But as a chaplain, and particularly as a military chaplain, this was very important. When there's a captive audience and you have the privilege to pray, I take very seriously by the fact that there are a lot of people who are not co-religionists, who do not have the same theology that I have. but that God has spoken to them and revealed God's self to them in one way and will reveal God ultimately in the way I understand. And when God is ready to do that, God will. But right now, I'm on their faith journey with them, and how do I help them to respond in prayer to the one they believe in? So this was the prayer offered this year. So you may or may not know that Congress begins every 2 years on the 3rd of January. That's the beginning of a new Congress. We're now in the 118th Congress. I started my job for the 117th Congress on the 3rd of January, 2021. And then 2 years later, the 3rd of January, 2023, was the opening of a new Congress. You may remember that week. It was rather exciting. Before we knew how exciting it was going to be, this was the prayer for the opening day. Eternal God, you spoke and the earth brought forth life. With a word, your spirit breathed into humanity the essence and purpose of our very being. Speak to us now, O Lord, and breathe into the body of the 118th Congress your word of truth and justice, compassion and wisdom. Give each member the guidance to be faithful stewards of this divine tasking and to wield this privilege carefully. Even as you grant us the favor to serve you in this place, remind us that amidst all the debate, you will always have the final word. Your word is alive and powerful, sharper than any two-edged sword. Divide then our souls and spirits, discern our thoughts and the intentions of our hearts, and may they be acceptable to you. Lay on the shoulders of these men and women the mantle of both responsibility and accountability. Nothing is hidden from your sight, and each will always answer to you. Call these who represent the hopes and dreams of the Americans who have voted them into office to heed first your voice as they uphold and defend the Constitution and its moral principles. Grant them strength and reason, purpose and insight. Bring this 118th Congress to life and breathe on us the creative work of your Holy Spirit. Give us eyes to see your guiding hand, ears to hear your wise truth, and hearts to hold firmly to the faith we profess in you. We pray this in your sovereign name. Amen. The floor is yours. Yes, sir. There is a White House chaplain. Interestingly enough, it is an active duty Navy chaplain and has responsibility for Thurmont, which is Camp David, and offers sermons at the Camp David Chapel, which is a darling chapel. And when the president is residing at Camp David, will or will not take advantage of worship services there. And that chaplain has had a great deal of influence. A dear friend of mine was chaplain to President Bush during the period of the Iraq-Iran war and had great counsel with him. So yes, there is a Navy chaplain at the White House. Yes, ma'am.
I'm a little confused or perplexed that, and I think it's a privilege and fantastic that there's prayer offered in the highest governmental assembly, and yet at some point it was voted out of the public school system, and I was teaching at a university at the time, and I was teaching nursing, and I had, like you, a very eclectic religious group from internationally and from all kinds of faiths, and we did say prayer in the classroom, but every so often we'd have a luncheon gathering with the students, and someone would offer prayer for the luncheon, and we'd even take turns with different faiths. Mm-hmm. And then at some point I was told, you can't do that.
Oh my. That is perplexing, especially since you seem to have handled it so justly.
Yeah, and I think it's the same through the K-12 system. They're no longer allowed.
I can't hear the question.
I'm sorry, I'll repeat it for you. I meant to do that. So her question...
They're no longer allowed to have prayer in the K-12 as well.
She talked about how perplexed she is that they no longer allow prayer in schools. And she offered an example of how they had a luncheon, and a regular luncheon, and there were people who were representative of different faith traditions, and so they would take turn offering prayers to open the luncheon. And they were told essentially to cease and desist from that no prayer was allowed. and that she said that in the K through 12 schools, my response to the first part of it was it is unusual that it seemed to be sort of a voluntary gathering that they had, that they were told to cease and desist.
Well, it was on university grounds.
Because it was on university grounds, that's why it was. And I think that is a misinterpretation of the role of prayer. I think the university is a very interesting environment. It seems to be inclined to yield to moderation rather than inclusivity. I mean, even recently, if you've seen in the news, there have been several guest speakers who've been invited to speak, and then the protests have shut them down. But then there was a woman who spoke back. She didn't take on the invitation, but she made a point of writing back to them. And this actually was in California, of all places. And she wrote back and she said, and this is what you're missing. Because it isn't just freedom of religion, it's freedom of speech. And I think we're at an interesting flexion point because we do believe in the free expression, and we believe in freedom of speech. And yet there are many voices and strong and violent voices who are trying to squelch some and amplify others. It will be very interesting to see how that plays out in the future, and prayer, of course, will be caught up into that conversation as well. I encourage you, however, to, in whatever environment that you can, is to speak into the conversation, because when I said about the 10, 10, and 80 rule, we as Americans fall into that same realm, right? There are 10% of the crazies over here and 10% of the crazies over here, but the 80% of us are silent. And it took somebody like the woman in California, whom I would have argued is probably one of the 80%, to finally say something back. We have a role to play to say religion matters. But in doing so, I would suggest, I would argue, I would encourage you to be very careful that you too are respective of religious freedoms. That it isn't just my way or the highway. You know, that it is an opportunity that if you say you want to pray, that you're ready to let the Catholic chaplain take the rostrum too. 1789 argument, right? Are you ready to allow people of different faiths and different faith traditions to share that same rostrum? Yes, sir.
Did you, in your time as a military chaplain, was there a different characterization of who came to you for help versus what you're dealing with 435 people
Okay,
in Congress?
the question is, as a military chaplain, did I experience a difference in the kinds of people who would come to me for help and what I find in Congress? And the answer is absolutely yes. Part of being a military chaplain is the 24-hour, 7 days a week, 365 days, that you are with your congregation, truly. And so there were times that I was like the only person in the room at the end of an evolution of some sort. One of my favorite stories is, and it's kind of fun, but it takes a little long, but I was getting ready to go on a hike with a bunch of Marines. It was early in the morning, dark 30, if you like that phrase. And we were all in camouflage. So in camouflage obviously means camouflage. I was camouflaged as being the chaplain. And so I'm walking down the hall, the line here as I'm getting to my place on the front of the file, and I'm doing what chaplains do. How are you? Great day for a walk today, huh? Are you all ready? How much you got in your pack back there, And just, my gosh, it's early. Did you get any sleep last night? Just doing what chaplains do, all right? And I had just passed a couple guys, and I heard one guy turn back, and he goes, "Who the F was that?" And the guy next to him says, "That's the chaplain." And he says, "Whoa, shit." And I hear all this, I look and I went. So that's part one of the story. Part two of the story is, so then we take off on the hike, and the hike is two files, and I'm on the front, and one of the things Marines love to do is they take the guidon, which is the pole that has their unit flag on it, and the guidon is always in the front. You are guiding on it, and they'll come up and they'll grab the pole and they'll run around the entire formation. It's very motivating. Everybody, oh, yeah, hoorah. You know, they go around. So let's call this fellow that I had talked to earlier, let's call him Lance Corporal Smith. Lance Corporal Smith, who clearly is a character, he comes up and he grabs the guidon. Well, to get to the guidon, he has to get past me. So he makes the loop round and coming past me, and I said, oh no, one more time for penance. So it goes back around. Ha ha ha, everybody's fine. So that's part 2 of the story. Part 3 to the story. Long day, they're in the field, they're doing weapons qualifications, you know, we're eating MREs, it's a gross hot day in Camp Lejeune. And it's nighttime and I'm just walking around the camp doing what chaplains do. How was your day today? Did you qualify? You know, did you get that nasty MRE that I got? You know, all those things. And who comes up to me but Lance Corporal Smith? And he says, hey, Chaplain, you got a minute? And out comes his life story. And it was beautiful. It was lovely. For me, that is the epitome of being a military chaplain. Because we had experienced from the very beginning a moment that then the thread was with us all day so that he trusted me enough to share his life story. Now in Congress, I don't have the thread. For one, I'm not a member of the command, if you will. There are 435 commands. And when they go on a hike, they go on a hike by themselves. They don't bring the chaplain. Their schedule is much different. They are in committee meetings, they're on radio talk shows, they're on doing everything, and the only time I have a chance really to have any interchange with them is when they're voting on the floor. And to be honest, this is where COVID did me a service, in as much as they were trapped on the floor for hours. And it was kind of like coffee hour here at church, right? And so I would do what chaplains do. How are you, man? That's a long vote. What are you going to be doing next, you know? And then eventually I would get a couple stories from people. People are not quite sure, though, however, what a chaplain does. Chaplains have been in the military service just a little bit longer than they've been in the House and the Senate. And yet, that integration into the fabric of the body is not quite there. My role is much, in their eyes, is much more ceremonial. I pray for everything. A new statue. I'm praying for a new stamp this week. And that's okay, but what I really would hope, and it's coming bit by bit, because trust is at a premium up there, is that I would have that entree into their lives, and I have in many cases. And sometimes it takes some initiative, obviously, on my part. I'll hear of somebody who is ill, and I'll make a point of connecting. Somebody who's lost a family member, and I'll drop them a note and then follow up. You know, there's a lot of that, and eventually they're beginning to trust that I'm not one party or another, all right? Emily shared with you, I was voted in by the whole House, but I was under Nancy Pelosi's speakership. So there was an immediate certainty that I was a Pelosi pick. It was, in fact, a bipartisan committee that selected me. 3 Republicans, 3 Democrats, who brought my name before the speaker, who had the foresight to made me interview with the current speaker, who was the minority leader at the time. So, and then, oh, by the way, the House votes me in. The whole 435 have to vote on me, not just one speaker. However, it's taken a while for people to realize that a female Presbyterian does not necessarily mean I'm one thing or another. It's funny, though, how many people assume I'm one thing or another, and I have said nothing. But there it is. So it's different. It's a very different thing. Yes, sir. Let me continue this guy first.
Would you tell us about your life on January 6th and January 7th?
Yes. I assume you mean on 21?
Yeah, most likely.
As I indicated, I am an apolitical person. In military service, I didn't get engaged in politics. I don't like politics. To be honest, I don't really like politicians. I've learned to love them. And a few I like. But coming into this call, this job, I know as a chaplain you need to understand the institution. So it was a joint session on January 6th, which is a big deal, by the way. There's lots of pomp and circumstance established with joint sessions. And joint sessions, there are several reasons for joint sessions. It may be the State of the Union, it may be the electoral vote, it may be a member of parliament from India, the Dalai Lama, whomever. And they'll do a joint session. So anyway, it's a joint session, and the Senate parades in. It's very, very cool. If you've been in the Capitol, our chambers are in the same level. But they have to cross through the rotunda and through Statuary Hall, and they come into our back doors, and they come down. And so in this day, because it's the electoral vote, they have the electoral boxes, and they're there. And it's a really very formal, very exciting thing. And I see the vice president, we're like, I'm kind of on a pew back there. We have eye contact. I'm like, I saw the vice president. I see all these people who just had contentious elections. Wow, I'm really in it. I'm really in this. So I'm just taking this whole thing. And then they start through the electoral votes, and it's very exciting. The first three are pretty benign, yes, everybody good. And then, of course, then we get to Arizona. And obviously there was the debate there. Well, when that happens, then the Senate withdrew. So they parade back out so that they can do their debate in their chamber, and we do our debate in our chamber. And so that's where we were at the time. And while I'm there, and as I say, I'm sort of in the middle, and it's an amphitheater, so I have a pretty good perspective on what's going on. I noticed, and this was part of my military training, I noticed that what I would have called a personal security detachment, they've got a different name in the House, they come sort of, what looks like a personal security detachment comes around the speaker and spirits her away. And I went, that's different. And then I look and I see a personal security attachment surround the minority leader. And they spirit him away. That's interesting. And then the leadership, majority leadership, and several key people were literally spirited away. I thought, that's not right. And then Captain Policeman stood up on the rostrum and said, ladies and gentlemen, there's been an incursion. We'd like you to get your breathing apparatus, which is just underneath your seats, and because there's a good chance of a chemical attack. And so great shuffling, for any of you who have served in military service, the breathing apparatus is not what you think. It's not like the gas masks you see. It's more like a dry cleaner bag that you put over your head and hope that you can breathe. The one that says, don't let children play with it. That was my first impression. But the other thing that impressed me is the number of people, when they told us, do not open it, how many members did. But then, okay, so I'm making light of things. However, a great deal of chaos in the room. One of the clerks down, and I'm here, and this is the rostrum, looks up at me and goes, oh, wow, and asks me to pray. So I come down on the rostrum and offer an extemporaneous prayer from the rostrum, and it was not recorded for the record because they turned off they'd stopped recording formally for the record. They were, however, recording should we get subpoenaed later. So there is a recording of it, but it's not in the congressional record. And I prayed. Now, when I prayed, there was a great deal of noise in the room. I have no idea if anybody heard me, saw me. Remember, they don't know me. I do wear a clerical collar. I had chosen to wear a clerical collar because there's so many people dressed up so nicely. I wanted them to know that I was a chaplain and not a staffer. So that was clear. But I had no idea whether anybody heard me. And it wasn't until much later that I heard a number of pieces. And it went everywhere from, I thought we were on the Titanic because the chaplain was praying, or I felt that there was peace in the room because the chaplain was praying. I went back to my area and I went to go get my box with the breathing apparatus, and my inclination was sort of to stay there because I knew immediately at that point who was prior military. And, I needed to be with my people, right? I know where the fight is, and I wanted to be on the front line, if you will, with my people who were in the immediate danger. And But it became very clear to me that that one sheep was fine, but the 99 were the ones who were in trouble. And I moved then with the rest of the members to an undisclosed location, where I had several conversations along the way, and was able to kind of, I felt very, very calm. As I shared with Emily earlier this morning, that day was not at all fearful for me. It was an affirmation of the call that I had taken, that I knew I was there for a reason. I've been in combat, I've been in chaos, I've been with people in crisis, and I knew what to do. And so when we got to the room, I walked around and just did what chaplains do. And how are you doing? And I realized, of course, you know, when you say how are you doing, they say fine. And I changed my approach and said, I noticed most of them were on their phones. And I'd say, does everybody you know and love know you're okay? And they'd say, yep. Pardon me. And then we'd have this conversation about who they know and love. And I did this for about 2 hours. And then I realized after about 2 hours that, I wonder if the people I know and love know I'm okay. And I had a little battery left on my phone, and I call home, and my daughter, who at the time was 23, she says, oh, that's okay, Mom. We've been tracking you on Find My Friends. So that's my January 6th experience. Yes, sir.
You answered part of my question. You are recording the prayers, but are they available to the chaplain prayers available to the public?
They most certainly are. In fact, when I was asked to offer a prayer or to share a prayer today, I ran onto the chaplain's website, and we have a prayer archive. All the prayers that have ever been prayed are recorded in the archives. It's part of the congressional record. So if you go to chaplain.house.gov or something like that, just look up Chaplain of the House, and you'll find it on. If you look that up in Google, they're on the prayer archives. There is a fellow on YouTube who works for C-SPAN, and he segments out the videos of Chaplain Black and myself daily. They used to be first thing on his site. Now you have to dig a little bit for them, but he has there's several recordings of our prayers online as well.
It feels like things are especially contentious, things being the political environment. And I know the years have been contentious, but at this moment it feels especially heightened. I'm curious as to your opinion and whether or not you're optimistic. What are you optimistic about? What are you encouraged by in your daily dealings with these households?
The question is, excuse me, I'm going to run back here and grab a last one. The question is, things seem particularly contentious these days in the House, and even more so than in the past, perhaps. And do I have anything of which I'm optimistic? Well, the answer is yes, they are particularly contentious. But when you look back on history, this is how we started. We started being contentious. And look at the amazing country we have become. You know, we are being tested by fire day after day after day as individuals, as communities, and naturally then as a country. This is our fire. Does that make me optimistic? No, but it makes me rely on my faith. Inasmuch as God uses these trials, these fires, these challenges to hone and to lift up what is good. That might be a little esoteric for an answer, although I believe it very strongly. What makes me really hopeful, though, is the 80. You know, you're hearing the 10 and 10. You need to realize that. The people who grab the cameras are the people who are making a point of what one person I've read called conflict entrepreneurs. They make hay out of conflict. Hay could be money, hay could be fame, but they're making hay out of conflict. They are conflict entrepreneurs. Those are the ones that you're seeing online, on television, and hearing on the radio. There are 80% who don't hog the camera, but who are just laboring day after day and take this job so seriously and are so committed to doing things right. That makes me hopeful. But it makes me sad because it took me taking this job to find that out. And I would argue even it's because I have this job alone as a chaplain, just being, if I just showed up on the floor as a staffer, I wouldn't know that. But because I have access as a chaplain to so many different people and so many different moments in their lives, I realize how real they are. And that makes me exceedingly hopeful. Then the third piece is that, I've said again, they don't call them representatives for nothing. That 80% represents you. And the hope is in the communities that vote these people in. And if the community cannot just put it on one person. This is the sad thing I see in a lot of these members. They get it from everyone. They get grief from every corner of their world. You know, there are people telling them all the time how to do their jobs. Well, part of doing their jobs is representing you. So how are you doing your jobs? What are you doing to support them? To set in motion the things that you want them to put the government's imprimatur on? How are you doing that? Let me double back and say, though, that that's also a thing that I came to realize is that they have lots of people telling them how to do their jobs. Is God also telling me how to do my job? Maybe that's why they're avoiding me. So, are all the questions coming from this side? Did you pay them all? You fed them your questions. There's nothing over here. I want to be very sensitive to make sure that people are getting their questions answered.
How long is your term?
My term is 2 years, technically. I'm re-voted in every 2 years. It does seem to be sort of a gentle person's agreement that I stay as long as I like it and they like me. And right now, we're good.
Okay, so you have 43 crazies here, you got 43 crazies here. Is it more difficult dealing with the crazies than it is the 80%?
Internally, yes. No, because they're human too. I can speak on him because he's not a member anymore, and I think he'd get a kick out of knowing that I speak about him. People ask me, who surprised you the most? You guys, you all know the name Louis Gohmert from Texas? He's technically one of the crazies, but one of the nicest guys on the planet. He just has, you put a quarter in that machine, and man, you get some great stories. And they just don't stop. And he's just a gentle, caring kind of guy. And so to deal with the crazies really means to find, okay, what don't I know about them? How do I get to know who they are, who their families are, what are they dealing with? And that takes a little work and intention on my part. Because, who wants to deal with the crazy? But I got to love them too. And I need them to know that they're loved. Because they will have a crisis in their life. And they will need to have somebody who's going to be able to come alongside them. And the only way that's going to happen is if I establish a trusting relationship with them. Yes, ma'am?
What's your working relationship with Reverend Black?
With Chaplain Black, my working relationship with Chaplain Black is a great one. He also was a Navy chaplain. He also was the chief of chaplains 20 years prior to me. In fact, he's going to celebrate his 20th year anniversary as chaplain of the Senate on June 27th, in a week. I worked with him in the chaplain corps, never for him. When I say with, we were in the chaplain corps at the same time, and I had interaction with him then, and he actually was the one who put my name in. He and one other person had put my name in for consideration. There were 5 people considered for my job. And we also, we get to share the ceremonial responsibilities. I'll do the invocation, he'll do the benediction. I never like to follow Barry Black because he's got the voice of God. And occasionally we're asked to do speaking engagements. We've done 2 now at the National Cathedral. But it's very collegial, he's very, very thoughtful and just a great, great guy.
So you said if you hear something's going on in their lives, you reach out to them. You've got the morning prayer. Is there a normal day? Do people just pop in? Do they call and say they want to spend some time with you? How does it work?
So the question is, what's my normal day?
If there's
That's a great question because there really are no normal days. But the prayer is certainly the priority, and I generally have written the prayer the day before. So anything before the prayer is just sort of maybe getting ready for the prayer the next day or some other things that I have going on. But the prayer, and then I wait, and then I have to determine when the votes are. And the votes could be in an hour and a half, or they could be in 5 hours. And so it's kind of staying present and available for those. I have a lot of people who come to visit me because I'm the chaplain, not because I'm Margaret, but because I'm the chaplain. And people from all over the world have come over to pray for me, which is, I find fascinating. And not pray on me either. They're praying for me. And they come in, and they're little old women from all over the country from an organization called Aglow. And then there's a Korean church who came to the United States just to pray for the United States, and not to tour, but they come to the Capitol to pray for important people. And they included me in that. There's just, I get the most unusual groups who want to come in. I have 2 groups coming in Thursday. A Jesuit school that they bring a classroom of students in every year, and they always want to meet with the chaplain. And with all that always comes so there's being a present for that. And having people pray for you is a fascinating thing, especially when that's your job, is to pray for people. So there's a lot of flexibility on voting days. And at some point I have to make sure I have my head in the game to prepare the prayer for the next day. By the way, 90% of my prayers are based on a scripture. You might have heard the scripture in the January 3rd prayer. Actually, there were 2. But I always base my prayer in scripture, so that takes a little bit of time and thought to kind of think through the prayer. I also write a weekly reflection for the members and the staff. Some members are receiving it, some, it's a matter of getting the word out. That's a very challenging thing on the Hill, I've discovered. But there are about 600 people on the mailing list from the staff who receive this. It's an internal thing. So it's really kind of strange. I feel a little guilty. There's no normal day, and it sounds like all I do is pray. But somehow the day is occupied, and I don't get home until 8. So that's kind of my day. Yes, ma'am.
Do you ever get pushback from representatives about your prayers?
Thank you. Very insightful. I know you're a Presbyterian pastor. You get it. Do I get pushback from my prayers? So there I was on my 2nd month. And I have to tell you, I'm an empath. I pick up emotions in a room. It's just part of who I am. And I have never been in a room with so much contention or acrimony as it was in that time frame. And remember, they were talking about COVID relief bills and a handful of other things. And of course, we'd had the January 6th event, we'd had an impeachment, we'd had inauguration. That was just the first one. And now we're in the COVID relief bill and so forth. And I had never, ever experienced that much contention. Up to that point, all my prayers have been in the first person plural. God help us, we, our. But that one day, the day of the vote, which I knew was a big deal, first time, and I don't know why I did it, I switched to the third person plural. God help them, they, their. It was very pointed to them. It was a little edgy, but I still don't think it was partisan, because I used like Colossians, and I used things like kindness and forgiveness and, humility, thoughtfulness, basic words like that. And darn if the darn Washington Post doesn't pick it up. And the next day, so that was a Wednesday, the next day, nobody said anything on Wednesday, except there were a handful of people in the room. By the way, very few people are in the chambers when I pray. C-SPAN is the best place you can, and oh, by the way, if you really are C-SPAN addicts, you can watch me pray every time there's a legislative day. But nobody said anything except a few people, Democrats, who were in the room. And one guy said, well, it is Lent, and he, It wasn't, I didn't think it was that bad, but okay, it was pointed, and I knew it was. And then Thursday, it hits the Washington Post. And darned if 3 Republicans, and this is, I get bipartisan pushback, this just happens to be the Republican example. 3 Republicans came up to me individually and said, "How dare you be so political in your prayer? That was horrible. I am just offended. You ought to be fired. I don't know how we hired you. You should not be this chaplain. Are you the chaplain? Are you the one who prayed that prayer that was in the Washington Post?" And I know for a fact these people had not heard the prayer, but they had read the Washington Post. But it clued me in. It clued me in, and what it clued me in on was 2 things. One is, who is my audience? In many ways, I think it's the 435. But I just told you there are very few of them in the room, very few of them listening. In other ways, it's the American public. Because there are a lot of people, for whatever reason, watch C-SPAN. But the most important, I have always thought, was God. But the other 2 don't realize that that's who my audience is. And that I am praying to God on behalf of the government. That's one of the things I realized. But the other thing I realized is the thing I shared with you just a little bit earlier. They're all getting it from somebody. Lots of people are telling them how to do their jobs. And so they have reactive defenses and are ready to take a hit. And they thought I was giving them a hit. And so I got pushback. So what I did I came back on Wednesday and I went, I think that was a little harsh. Read the prayer to my husband and daughter. My husband's a dyed-in-the-wool Republican. My daughter doesn't tell me. But I have an idea. Doesn't matter to me. She just kind of goes, ooh. Tim says, "You prayed that?" I went, "Yeah, uh-huh." Oh boy. My daughter says, "Tomorrow, butterflies and rainbows. Pray butterflies and rainbows tomorrow, Mom." I said, "Okay, got it." So it was a pretty benign butterfly rainbow prayer Thursday. But that Thursday is the day I got the pushback. So Friday, I prayed in the first person singular. God, forgive me if I failed to appreciate the challenges the members face in these challenging decisions that they have to make day to day. God, forgive me if. And I wrote a letter to anyone who wrote to me, who spoke to me, and said, I ask you forgiveness. I didn't ask for forgiveness for the prayer. I asked for forgiveness that I didn't understand them, and that perhaps I didn't understand them well enough to represent them pastorally. And how could I do that better? And each one came back to me in their own form and said that they appreciated the conversation. That's one example of pushback. There's some more recent examples, like the week of the vote of this last Congress. I got a little bit of pushback on that. But I will say, I also got applause. First time I've gotten applause on the floor. But as I mentioned, the trolls in social media, well, they're another story. So yes, one's getting pushback.
So most of your pushback, it sounds like, is more from a political than a theological.
Always political.
Yeah, so you don't have an atheist saying, why are you talking about God's word?
No. No, I do have an atheist who wants to have an atheist prayer as a guest chaplain. I'm biting my tongue. But no, never a theological thing. However, what's interesting, anytime I've gotten pushback, it's either been when I've used Colossians or Ephesians, that passage on compassion, forgiveness, humility, kindness. Since when did they become trigger words? That's really a scary thought. I know that Emily's preaching on love this year. You know, you'd think that you all have that down, but we don't, if compassion, kindness, forgiveness, and humility are trigger words.
So you secret about Jesus.
Say again?
You see where those words got Jesus.
You see those words, Jesus, right. That's right. Anybody else? Yes, ma'am.
Can you address the situation with chaplains in the military, because they're trying to really get rid of a lot of the things that the chaplains do in some sects of the military?
I would disagree with you 100%.
Okay.
That is not the truth.
Okay, good.
Chaplains are on solid ground. The Navy has increased their need for chaplains because their demand for chaplains because they've established the need. They realize that chaplains have access in ways that mental health providers do not just access, but influence. Military chaplains are the least of your worries.
Okay. Because I've read where they have been challenged and
What they've been challenged on is, and this is the part I think it's a nuance, but it is a nuance with a difference. When chaplains come in, and this is part of my challenge too, my chaplains come in and say, I'm going to preach Jesus, and you're going to let me preach Jesus, and if you don't let me preach Jesus, you are discriminating against my faith. As a military chaplain, you have every right to preach Jesus from a pulpit of co-religionists, among co-religionists. But when you're in a command of people who left their home, hearth and home, from different faith traditions or no faith tradition, your responsibility, and the only reason why there's a military chaplaincy, is to facilitate for their free expression of religion. That's your agency. You're wrong. Ma'am, you had a question?
How many women have served as chaplains of the Senate and the House?
One. But interestingly enough, there was a guest chaplain to the Senate in like 1855. I just discovered that. She was a woman from Boston and Chicago, and she was asked to be a guest chaplain in the Senate in the 1800s. Amazing. I just learned that the other day. In my sick stupor, so I'm not quite sure I caught the date, but I'm fairly sure it's in the 1800s. Anybody else?
You know, being an Air Force retiree, I'm wondering why there aren't any Air Force chaplains represented.
Why are there no Air Force chaplains represented?
You know, I just wonder.
I don't know.
Is there such a strong cadre of naval chaplains?
That's a great question. The first time I've ever gotten that one. I don't know why Navy chaplains, but remember, Chaplain Black and I are the first military chaplains to have ever served. I'm only the 62nd chaplain of the House. He's only the 60th chaplain of the Senate since 1789. So 234 years, there have only been 60 over that side and 62 on my side. Since that brouhaha in the 1850s when they reestablished, I'm only the 7th chaplain to have served. So the chances of people becoming a chaplain are slim anyway, regardless of their background. The fact that they have chosen 2 military chaplains, I think, is significant, and Barry Black likes to say about his interview. They asked, because they were taking people from tall steeple churches. Peter Marshall, somebody who's somebody. Peter Marshall being one of those examples. We're taking people who are well known as preachers. Halverson, that's another one. And sure enough, when Barry was being interviewed, there were a handful of other people being interviewed, all from tall steeple churches, well-known pastors. And the committee asked him, why should we take you? And he says, well, because I know what it means to work with a variety of people in a pluralistic environment, to be with them one-on-one every day. To use my phrase, eat, sleep, breathe, and endure what the institution is eating, sleeping, breathing, and enduring. That's why you need me.
Carriers and battleships have tall steeples.
Carriers and battleships have tall steeples, or masts, as the case may be. But I was never a carrier chaplain. I think we've exhausted your questions. I'm not exhausted. I'm happy to answer any more, but I want to thank you for the opportunity to share with you. And if I can, I'd like to close in prayer. Unless we had a...
Can I just have one moment of privilege? And
Sure, absolutely.
to say thank you, and very selfishly, I didn't shut it down earlier because I wanted to hear all your answers and I wanted to hear all your questions. But I can't help but think about Don Mullen and something that I am taking away from what you've taught us over the last 24 hours, which is that this, I'm reflecting on this 80-20-80 rule. I think one of our biggest hurdles as a community of human beings is to be able to look at people and not see one thing. Perhaps when you came, you thought military chaplain, and you thought one thing about Margaret, or you thought woman, or first woman, or Presbyterian, like you have said. And I think that continues to get us in trouble. And what you have shown us and taught us so much is how we can approach people in a way that is loving and extremely faithful and with integrity to our own faith, and not just see Republican, Democrat, Baptist, Presbyterian, Highlands, seasonal, year-round, whatever categories we want to put people in, and you do it with integrity to who you are. And so I just want to say thank you for that example, and whether you knew it or not, in the spirit of who I think Don Mullen was always stretching us to be. So
Thank
you're
you.
a wonderful speaker for us. And we
Thank
love
you.
that.
It's truly, it's my privilege to pray. And it's something I do take very seriously, as you can imagine. And as I tried to impress on you yesterday, it's a privilege we all have. But I'll assume the privilege today. Would you pray with me? Gracious and almighty God, I thank you for this congregation, for the people who are here, but most importantly, that you are here, that you have chosen to be among us, that you've come around us to inspire us to serve you wherever you've called us. We thank you that you allow us to look backwards, to see how we started, not just how we've succeeded, but what our challenges were. Not to see how ideal we were, but perhaps how we were rejecting our ideals even while trying to codify them. God, help us to realize that none of us are perfect, but that we are called to be faithful, to show integrity, to live into the will that you have laid out before us. So wherever we find ourselves, in this community, in another community, as people who vote, as people who serve, as people, as your people, may we look within ourselves and realize that it's the relationship that we have with you that you are now calling us to have one with another. May our families, our communities, our government, our nation reflect that relationship in all that we say and do. We pray these things in the strong name of Jesus Christ. Amen.